Hello, everyone, and happy Tuesday. We are Group 2, and for our analysis of Aloft, we're going to focus on the mind of Aubrey Griffin. For our analysis, we're going to take you through the timeline of how we began to understand Aubrey's personality throughout this novella. Preston will begin with the introduction of Aubrey's personality. I'll touch on his trait of obsessiveness. Andrew will speak about his state of desperation. Sean will speak about how, despite all of this, he still has a very pure mind. And Daphne will wrap everything up with the evolution of Aubrey's thoughts. Let's get started.
Hello, my name is Preston Chen, and I will talk about Aubrey's introduction. Who is Aubrey at first? How does he come off as? What we know about Aubrey at the beginning of this book is that he's a 23-year-old college student who's a musician. I myself used to play orchestra, so I felt like someone connected to him. At the beginning, we see Aubrey trying to impress Harriet by skydiving. He seemed very ignorant at the time because he was trying to impress a girl. He also seemed like a snotty brat who didn't care about others and was considered quick on judgment. He was a bit controlling because he didn't want anyone to be with Harriet. He used his imagination to get himself out of troubling situations. He seemed lost and uncertain on what to do with his life. He also seems to think highly of himself and have quite the ego mentality, considering the fact that on page 285 states, Aubrey liked to think he was a gentleman. Aubrey's mental state was very low and could be seen somewhat connected to his cloud. This cloud. On page 242, he talks about him not mattering in this world. It made me feel connected to him considering the fact that he had no friends that he could rely on and was always alone in his thought. I had a same experience of being alone in my thought, not knowing what to do and leaving it up to my imagination. I believe that at the beginning, Harriet was something Aubrey can live for, considering the fact that he always thinks about her almost all the time. The connection that I had when reading about Aubrey was something I saw in a movie. It starts off with this. It starts off with a guy trying to impress a girl and trying to make her fall in love with him. Then later in the story, the guy would tell her his feelings, but then the girl rejects that feeling, and then the guy gets heartbroken. Then the heartbreak makes the guy grow into a man, which the girl who rejected him go crazy for him and apologizes. But then the guy rejects her. In the beginning of this course, I remember us discussing the cliches of literature and comparing them. Usually, when we think about the main character of a story, we think that he or she would be somewhat normal with admirable qualities, such as being heroic or kind. But Aubrey, on the other hand, doesn't meet those standards, rather, the opposite. So we might end up asking ourselves while reading about this character, is he even fit to be the main character?
From the very beginning, it is clear that Aubrey is obsessed with Harriet. However, this is a sign of a deeper character trait. For example, Aubrey appears to have a tendency to fixate on what he sees when he first lands on the cloud. On page 256, Aubrey claims, quote, "The coat rack meant something, was more than just a coat rack, but in his headachy state he could not work out its full importance." This idea is repeated again on page 264 when Aubrey seeks meaning for the end table created by the cloud. The repetition of the phrase "must mean something" gives insight to how Aubrey's mind gets stuck on these thoughts. Further, the attempted reasoning as to why he can't figure out how the cloud is creating these shapes brings to light a deeper sense of delusion. Aubrey's trying to convince himself that he doesn't understand because of the state of mind he's in. He allows himself to keep questioning everything because he ordinarily would understand. However, in reality, Aubrey's continual questioning of the situation and his compulsive need to excuse himself reveals that this isn't the first time he's had this need. Like his infatuation with Harriet, Aubrey's mind is fixated on the situation until he gets the answers he feels he needs. This obsessiveness is a part of who Aubrey is and how he thinks on a macro scale. However, Aubrey doesn't seem to have accepted this personality trait. On page 262, we read, quote, "It wasn't in Aubrey's nature to ruthlessly interrogate reality, calling bullshit on every unproven notion and improbable hope. Acceptance was his natural state. Running with the situation was the first rule of a good jam session." This is the exact opposite of what we see Aubrey actually doing. The incessant questioning of reality, as in the case of the cloud, is a ruthless interrogation of his current state, and his fantasy of Harriet is an improbable hope he's refusing to accept. He's not as laid back as he's claiming to be. The reference to the jam session is also interesting because it implies that Aubrey's able to build onto other people's actions. He can take what another person's doing and add on to it, but he can't follow the flow and pattern of his own life. While the obsessive nature is a key element in the character of Aubrey, the denial of this trait makes him seem almost delusional. Both are a key factor in the evolution of Aubrey's mind, alongside his state of desperation.
Hi everyone, Andrew Kim here, and I'm going to be covering this existence of desperation within Aubrey's mind as he spends his time on this cloud. So, first things first is that the desperation is quite clearly depicted. I don't think we can brush it off by saying like, oh, he mostly had a good time on this cloud, because as we've seen with the physical pain that he's had to endure and the flashbacks he's been having, it's quite obvious that he's suffering mentally as well. My first point of desperation is the contemplations of suicide, which is really the most desperate that you can get, I think. And it's specifically on page 302 when Aubrey has come across these 3 corpses of 3 people that have also stumbled upon this cloud before he had. And one of the corpses with a gun, he imagines it talking to him about the gun, saying, "Might come in handy, you never know. In another couple days, when you're too weak to stand, it might be just what the doctor ordered. Swallow one is needed for pain, and call me never." And one might say that, oh, it's not that bad because he's just imagining this. I think that's what makes it even worse, right? Because it lets us know that, Aubrey has formulated these thoughts in his head that if he can't find a way out from this cloud, the only way of escaping the suffering that he's going through is by ending his own life. Secondly, I have this desire to share a photo of the cloud coat rack to Harriet. And this, again, might come off as overly obsessive to some. One might say that this is just him being weird again towards a female. But I really think it's up to interpretation, because I noticed on page 257 we learned that Aubrey is a single male, only child, 22 going on 23. And this notion of an only child stood out to me because, well, I personally am an only child myself, and I seem to share this possibly negative tendency of Aubrey where I attach myself too easily to an individual or individuals, along with having to share every little bit of life that I find interesting to them. And I can definitely see how it comes off as annoying and possibly desperate, but no bad intentions really there, so it's just something that I found interesting. And lastly, I have this point about the questionable interaction with Cloud Harriet. And I say questionable because, well, firstly, it's no doubt pretty weird and quite desperate. Man had sex with a cloud, so yeah, that's pretty bad. But our group talked about this notion of what goes on behind closed doors. And we kind of put the logic together where we know Aubrey, we know the type of person he is, he's kind of weird, and we know what he knows, right? Aubrey is aware that the cloud gives him what he wants, as we've seen with the example of the coat rack, the table, and the water. If Aubrey understands that this island is going to spawn whatever he's thinking of, is it really unexpected to see or to read about this experience that he has with Cloud Harriet, knowing the type of person he is? So yeah, it's a question about whether or not it's expected versus unexpected, but definitely no doubt pretty desperate.
Although he can be a bit obsessive and definitely weird, Aubrey's really not a bad person. He has a kind heart in the sense that he puts the wants and needs of others before his own, which, as we see towards the end of the story, he develops that same sense of care for his own life in a very fulfilling ending. We see this on a number of different occasions, such as at the end of the chapter 19, where he's talking with Ronnie and the rest of the group about his last conversation with June, and Aubrey says, "We talked about how she wanted me to move on. That's exactly what I want to do. I want to move right on to the first thing on our list." And Ronnie responds, "Good man, we're jumping in 6 weeks." Aubrey lifted his chin with a mild nod of acceptance, although his stomach knotted with nervous tension. 6 weeks was so soon. Although Aubrey's this guy who's overly anxious and terrified of heights, he still commits to this promise and goes on the plane with the group despite having this crippling anxiety. We also see him place the needs of others before his own in chapter 2 as he's on the plane preparing to skydive. He decides to comfort Harriet in a moment of absolute sheer terror and looks forward to making sure she's okay. Even though he tries to back out at the very end, he's constantly checking in on Harriet to make sure that she's okay, that she feels comfortable before she goes and jumps. We see Aubrey place the feelings of others before his own again in chapter 2, when he's apologizing profusely for ruining everyone's time because he was so scared of jumping out of the plane that he decided to chicken out. But he comes to realize that no one's even listening. This becomes a recurring theme throughout the novella, where Aubrey over-indexes the importance of others' feelings, most notably with Harriet, in situations where he should be more concerned about his own safety and his own feelings. And lastly, we see this when Aubrey eats the cloud fruit that Harriet prepares, or should I say Cloud Harriet prepares for him. As he spends time on the cloud, he becomes immensely famished, and Cloud Harriet offers him a cloud fruit and what they call phantom turkey breast, as described on chapter 17, that causes a sharp, agonizing pain in his abdomen. And while he's in this immense pain, he notices Cloud Harriet near him and cries, "Excuse me, please," instead of yelling something much more blunt and vulgar, because of how he truly felt, but it wasn't in his nature, according to chapter 17, to be so rude towards Harriet. All in all, we see that Aubrey, despite his fears or unwillingness to act in certain situations, constantly puts the feelings of others before himself and refrains from any negative expressions towards other people. He's innocent in his love for others and truly wants those around him to feel happy, even if it is a hindrance towards his own life. While on the cloud, he prefers to live in this fantasy world where he views and interacts with the very best versions of the people around him, especially Harriet. And as he grows to be more accepting of his reality, his previous thoughts of anger and jealousy, which used to taint his mind, disappear, and he begins to show love towards people who were once his adversaries, most notably Cool Cal or Axe body spray.
Aubrey's evolution as a character is distinct from who he was in the beginning of the novella. The reader is introduced to a judgmental and obsessive individual that is Aubrey. After having endured his journey on the mysterious cloud, Aubrey comes to the realizations and reflections about how he'd acted before. His fantasy had soon become a relative reality while on the cloud, where he was quickly disturbed. The importance of his relationship with Cloud Harriet shows that after his imaginary fantasy was fulfilled, Aubrey was not satisfied with what the relationship ended up being. On 318, the roles were reversed, where now it is Cloud Harriet that wouldn't let Aubrey go, as he tells her, "I'm so sorry for you, but you cannot keep me here. You're killing me. I'm sorry you're alone, but you have to let me go. I don't want to be with you anymore." Aubrey finally feels the suffocating force that he had once put on Harriet to develop a relationship that never had any solid foundation. This dialogue contrasts from who Aubrey had been before the cloud incident, where he finally understands that he cannot force his fantasies on real people. While the flashbacks could be interpreted as simply that, it can also be seen as Aubrey's reflection on his past. His history with June's sickness and obsession with Harriet both serve to portray how destructive he was with his relationships. It's understood that Harriet and Aubrey's relationship was toxic and manipulative, where Aubrey sought a romantic partner who didn't reciprocate feelings, and Harriet took advantage of his vulnerability. June was able to bring a sense of realism to Aubrey's life, with her being his anchor to reality. After he had lost her, his experience on the cloud was a wake-up call to live in the moment rather than his daydreams he had spent his life building. The final moments of returning to Earth represents Aubrey's return to reality. After 23 years of imagining relationships and obsessing over the actions of others, Aubrey can finally perceive the importance of living in the moment and appreciating the people in his life who truly loved him for who he was. The last lines ease the reader's mind as Aubrey's instincts show care for his mother rather than his crush, as he figured his mother might like to know that he was alive. Aubrey's journey in the cloud was full of fantastical chaos that he had built in his mind, which he finally recognized to be purely that, a fantasy. As an audience, we hope for Aubrey to translate his experience into the real world, where he doesn't force his imagination, but rather where he can admire the world for its truth and the people for who they are. After the analysis of who Aubrey is through his desperation, obsessiveness, pure-mindedness, and finally his evolution of thought, we have a couple questions for the class. The first is, did Aubrey accept his personality on his own, or was he forced to by the cloud? The second, why did the author include the image of the Junicorn on the last page, and what did you interpret? Finally, the third, where will we go after the cloud incident? Will Aubrey return to his fantastical ways? Thank you so much for listening to our presentation about the mind of Aubrey Griffin. We're interested in how you interpreted Aubrey and his journey on the cloud.